Well, my name's Mike Smith, and I've just been appointed as the founding Executive Director of the Asia Pacific Civil Military Centre of Excellence. And it's a new centre, comes under the government and is part of the government's election commitment last year to try and improve civil-military collaboration in disaster and conflict management. So I think it's a very strategic role. Most of my career I was in the Australian Army and rose to the rank of Major General, had command appointments in almost every level from Lieutenant up to Brigadier, and then as a Major General was the Deputy Force Commander in the United Nations Peacekeeping Force in East Timor in 2000 and 2001. And that was a very operational role, but required a lot of strategic thinking as to how we could manage a very difficult situation. And then after leaving the military, after spending a bit of time in academia, I went to become the Chief Executive Officer at Austcare, which is an old and established Australian non-government organisation looking at refugees and displaced people, particularly in conflicts and in disasters. So I guess my appointment to this new position has seen me walking both sides of the street. I've been really influenced by the sort of Jeffrey Sachs of this world, who actually have alerted me to this incredible problem of the haves and the have-nots, and of the challenges that we face in trying to have a much more even world and bringing people out of poverty. Whilst many terrorists and the leaders of terrorist groups aren't necessarily poverty-stricken themselves, I think it's true that they're able to gain recruits from communities that see no hope in their lot in life. And when I look at the struggle of what we now look on as the Western world, you know, I come from a bit of a history background, I suppose, and all those things of the agrarian revolution and the industrial revolution, in many respects has been a balancing of the haves and the have-nots within those societies, a much more egalitarian and equal society to try and empower people much more at the grassroots and make them responsible for their own actions, but not segregate them from that decision making. And in a sense, that's what we have to do, I think, with the developed world. And one of my major concerns is that the very noble commitments of countries to the Millennium Development Goals to try and bring people out of poverty will probably not be met if we continue on the current trajectory. How did I learn the craft of being a strategist? Well, I'm not sure everyone would agree I'm a strategist, so that's probably the first thing to say. But I think what happens in your life is that the first thing that you have to learn to do is understand the environment in which you're working and be competent at doing things. So there's a learning phase. You can't do anything without knowledge. But then you've got to get beyond, if you could say, the skill set or the technical sense of doing what you're doing well, to say, where do we want to go and how can I influence that? And what is my position on this issue and how can I learn more about it? And some people aren't comfortable in that. I've learnt through bitter experience, both in the army, in multinational settings, and in Austcare, that change management is often the hardest thing to do. It's having a belief that you need to change, but it's getting everybody on board to change and perhaps accepting something that might not be exactly what you want, but as a step towards it. To me, I think probably as an ex-infantryman, I can only think in sort of, small numbers, threes, or something of that nature. So I think that the first principle of war applies very much to all endeavours of life, and that being selection and maintenance of the aim. And I think when often there is a failure in any endeavour in life, it's often because either that aim wasn't selected properly with a clear understanding by everybody what the aim was that you were trying to do, and more importantly often that it's not maintained, that people go off on tangents or go into areas which probably wasn't germane to the particular issue that they were supposed to be doing. So I think selection and maintenance of the aim has been something that's always, I suppose, driven me. Whenever I am been having problems or difficulties, I always come back and take a deep breath and say, what is it that we're actually trying to achieve? I think what often happens is that when governments commit their militaries to particular situations, they do so given a certain set of circumstances, and it is fairly clear what the military is going to do. But then the situation might change on the ground. And of course that's one of the reasons why the government is setting up this centre of civil military excellence, because I think they realise more and more that this integration between military and civil assets in conflicts and disasters is now almost incontrovertible. You have to be able to do both, and that means that you need to think it through. Of course aims can change on any type of endeavour. I think we've seen that very clearly in Afghanistan, where the first commitment was all about really getting Al-Qaeda. That required an overthrow of a government without really much thought about how that government would be developed and how sustainable peace might be achieved. In fact, a colleague of mine did an analysis of President Bush's strategy for Afghanistan, and I think it took over a year or thereabouts at least before the whole issue of nation building was actually being mentioned. So whilst they went in with a specific aim at that time, I think they've since learnt that there's no point overthrowing a government unless you can have a sustainable and durable peace. I'm not a businessman, but obviously, I've read quite a bit about the business moguls of both those who've created this current economic situation we're in, and those who are very different from that. And I think strategy, if I was to define it, I suppose it's the art of the possible, and it is an art. And I think strategy is always about thinking where you're going, what you're doing, and how you're going to get there, and saying where can I make or where can we make the best, get the best results. So there's a lot of compromise in strategy as well, because in order to get to an end point or an end state that you want to achieve, you can only do so by having people accept it and adopt it and do it. And that's not often easy, particularly when people are looking at things from very different perspectives. It's possible that in a couple of weeks' time I might be leading a delegation to Nepal with the United Nations to look at helping Nepal work out how the Nepalese army and the Maoist army can get beyond where they are at the moment, which is in a status quo sort of cantonment type situation, but it's not really going any further. And the good thing is that the Nepalese want this to happen, but they're not quite sure exactly how, and they're asking for assistance. So that'll be a particularly interesting endeavour, and one that I think will show that there will have to be compromise on both sides if they are sincere about having a sustainable peace. I was actually Director General of Future Land Warfare for a while, and it was pretty clear to some of us in the military or in the army that our fundamentals of land warfare that we had been saying for quite a number of years, probably since I first joined, although there had been changes in it, it had been pretty much at the margins. And with the revolution in military affairs occurring, the results of the outcomes of the end of the Cold War and everything else, it was really a requirement to reconsider the fundamentals of land warfare, to keep what was good, but to set off the army in new directions. And so we did that by actually trying to get comment from as much of the army as we could. There has to be buy-in, I think, you need leadership at the top, but you need buy-in from everybody. And I think if people have buy-in and are able to contribute, not to be seen to contribute, but to contribute in a meaningful way, they actually learn a lot themselves through that process. And invariably, most people then are quite prepared to accept the outcome of it. Now, the outcome is normally something like a strategic plan. I think some organisations go through the strategic planning process to say we've got to have a vision and a mission and some key performance indicators and all of that sort of thing, and that can be fairly easily done. You could get a couple of people from an organisation to write that and say you've got one. But it's far different than having something that you're actually using and that you're measuring yourself against and you're adjusting so the strategic plan has to be the art of the possible, not just the vision of where you want to go. It's good to have a vision, but it's got to be how you're going to get there and has to be translated into a proper business plan, of course. The current endeavour that I'm doing is probably my most testing, because this little centre is going across established government departments and agencies. So you could probably imagine that the new boy on the block arriving at a time of economic stringency, with the government giving me some money to do this, I might easily be seen as a threat or as an unnecessary addition to what government already has. So the way I've tackled that is very much to make it a whole-of-government process. This centre is currently under the Department of Defence, which might seem as a strange place to have a civil military centre, but the decision was taken by government that Defence actually had more assets to throw at it and get it off. But there's a recognition that it may not stay in Defence. It could actually move to another organ of government. We don't know yet. So it's got to start somewhere. But thankfully, the Secretary of the Department of Defence and the Chief of the Defence Force are committed to a whole-of-government approach. So within the funding for the positions that they've put up, they enable me to actually have in my centre people from Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, people from AusAid, have very close relations with the Australian Federal Police, with Emergency Management Australia, Attorney General's Department. And the strategic statement, which we're actually going to put out next week when the Prime Minister opens our little centre, actually is a reflection and a derivative of the work done by an interdepartmental committee process and by a strategic planning working group that had representation from the key departments and agencies and was facilitated by an outside agency, so that we didn't have strategic speak that actually reflected one particular department. One thing I've learned, I think, particularly in the area of conflict and disaster recovery, is that over the last, sort of probably 20 years that I've been involved in all of this, is that whilst you can get often some quick results, the long-term results, the sustainability of what you're trying to do, will only ever be achieved if there is buy-in at the local level. And often at that local level there's contested ground. It's not like a host population all has the same view, which has often been the problem in these sort of intrastate conflicts. So it's understanding who the stakeholders are, giving the stakeholders a voice, bringing them into the tent, I think, in some way or other. And that's not often easy, particularly if there's been acrimony. One thing I learnt with the refugee and displaced persons around the world over the last 6 years that I've been doing a lot of work with this, is that often these displaced people have no voice at all. You know, they are really, really at the mercy of other actors. And sometimes we wonder why the situation doesn't get better. Well, until you bring them into the tent and give them a decision-making role in this and make them have some say over the destiny of their own lives, then the situation will perpetuate. Getting an understanding of the stakeholders is a key element in the strategy. Let me give you an example. I read a document just last week, and it was talking about how the Australian Defence Force needed to operate in conflicts of the type that we're now seeing. And the emphasis was on the whole of government approach. And that was good that they were saying that the Australian Defence Force needed to understand the perspectives of the other Australian agencies. But there was no mention of actually the host government or the host country or the host population, which to me, at the end of the day, is an even more important issue. And so that's just an incredibly significant stakeholder, which means for the Australian Defence Force or the Australian Federal Police or for customs or immigration officials or anybody in the whole of government suit, if you like, working in those countries, they need an understanding of the country, of the culture, of the people, of the differences in that country, and a willingness to learn and listen. And as much as I have great admiration for Australians and think that we do things pretty well, maybe that's not always our strongest suit, and maybe we need to take a little bit more time to develop that. The context that I'm working in now, and to a large extent in Auscare as well, is very much this collaborative approach. Who are the stakeholders? What are we trying to achieve? What's the various attitudes and perspectives of those stakeholders? So a lot of this comes around the work that our centre will be doing is actually in the area of knowledge management. So we'll be doing research, we'll be doing lessons learned, we'll be doing training and education and doctrine development. That's really the focus of my centre. And that's not doing it in some sort of isolated vacuum. That's actually doing that with the various stakeholders. The challenge is trying to create a better situation on the ground, but by doing so at the front end, at the policy end. To give you some examples of what I mean in both the disaster context and the conflict context. I think it's pretty obvious that Australia has responded very well to the situation in Timor-Leste, or East Timor as we refer to it still. Without Australia's involvement, you know, it's probably unlikely that we would have an independent country there, and clearly, you know, they do look to Australia for assistance. But there's a growing feeling that a lot of that assistance we've been giving has been very much stovepiped through individual agencies. So in 2006, when of course the conflict reignited, we actually had a situation where the police and the military were fighting each other, and where there wasn't much development assistance getting down to the grassroots level, to right where the people really needed it. So they were really suffering. And yet we had a lot of money going in there from Australia in their various stovepipes. So I think that's created some thinking about, well, maybe we could have done that in a better way, a more whole of government way, to get a better end result. More recently, we've seen in Afghanistan the military undertaking work in reconstruction in a very difficult province called Uruzgan, where the Taliban have been extremely active and where there's very, very few civil actors there. And so as part of the strategy to pacify that province, the military has been doing work through what they call provincial reconstruction teams. And of course the military is saying, why aren't there more civilians there doing this work as well? And that's created a whole raft of thinking about well, maybe we needed to have thought that through a little bit better before we actually started doing that, so that we could do it in concert with civil agencies and non-government organisations better than we perhaps did at the outset. I don't think you can send out a bureaucrat or a military officer and expect them to be an anthropologist, but they need to go knowing they need to get somebody who can advise them on that. And when I did my lessons learned book from East Timor, one of the things I put in was that we now talk about military commanders having political advisors and development advisors. Actually what they need is anthropologists to advise them, because at the basis of it is the culture. And I was initially laughed at a bit by people when I suggested that, and now that's starting to happen. Sure. People are saying, yeah, you're right, and that's particularly the case in these sorts of environments where only about 20% of the commitment's going to be the shooting war. The other 80% is the whole political, cultural, economic situation. So that has to be fused together. And I'm told that MacArthur sent back a message to Washington when he was in Japan. I don't know how true this is, but I use it a lot when I give presentations because I like it. It adds some grist to my argument. He sent back a message that said, don't send me any more economists, send me some anthropologists. What he was actually saying, I think, is I really need to understand these people if we're going to help them rebuild their country. I think anybody at my level needs to have time in their day to actually, needs to make time in their day to get away from the hurly-burly of what's going on, the meetings, the writing of the reports. Needs to actually take time out in their day to reflect. I think that's the most important thing of a strategist and a leader, to take that time to reflect. And of course, very few leaders these days have that time. I think this is a really sad thing. And I'm not good at it because I get captured by the moment. It's very easy to be captured by the next priority that people are asking for. And so you need mechanisms to almost force you to do that. At the moment, on my very small team, I'm refusing to do certain things. I'm saying, no, I'm not going to do that, because if I do that, I'll be back down at that level, and I won't be up at that level. Of course, it's all hands to the pump on certain issues when the government wants something done, but you have to guard against that, I think. So you need reflective space, time, and you need mechanisms to enable you to bounce ideas, to have free thinking, to do that, and to encourage that within an organisation through not only a senior management team, because the best ideas actually are often at the floor level. Yeah. Probably two things that they should do. The first is stay focused on what it is they're trying to achieve, and don't get captured by the capillaries. Don't massage the capillaries, stay on the jugular, and always bring yourself back to the jugular. What is it? What is it that we're trying to do, and what's my role in achieving that? Because there are all sorts of things out there to take you off in other directions and to lose the emphasis of what you're really trying to do. So stay focused. At the same time, I think you have to think outside the square. You have to be always challenging, saying, yes, well, fine, we're doing that now, but where do we want to go in the future? And that means you need to be highly sensitive to the environment, to the future, to where it's going. My first priority is going to have to be for this centre to get some runs on the board, because unless we can show in this centre that we are value adding to the work of the other government departments, then I don't think that we will be able to survive. So we have to have runs on the board. So that means in that area of research, training, education, lessons learned, development of doctrine, we have to pick what we think are the key areas that we can actually deliver on, because we could be doing a myriad of things. So again, it comes down to this selection and maintenance of the aim and saying, what can we do well? Let's do that, and we won't worry about the others. So let's take that forward, and let's say we're successful, and in 20 years' time, the Centre of Excellence is seen as a wonderful attribute of government and all the rest of it. I would hope by then that whoever is the executive director will be very much at that leading edge of being able to guide things in a way that prevention is better than cure. Because if you look at what's happened in the civil military space over the last 10 years or so in Australia, it has been very much a response mechanism. And the real success of my centre will be when 80% of its work is on conflict prevention and disaster risk reduction mechanisms, rather than how are we responding to something. That will be, for me, the litmus test for the success of the centre.